Welcome, everybody. The purpose of this screencast is to help you understand the information in chapters 2 and 3 of our textbook, which is a discussion of the political environment and how that influences business. So, what I've done is I have collected the information from the chapter. I've added some additional information to balance that out, and I have packaged it and presented it in a different way. So as you can see across the top, I have different political orientations: the extreme left wing, the moderate left wing, the centralist, the moderate right wing, and then the extreme right. And as you can see, this is called a linear political spectrum in as much as it is one line. So on the left-hand side, you can see different characteristics of how they can be differentiated. For example, historical figures who have practiced the different orientations, the theoretical or philosophical bases of these political orientations, other names for these political orientations, what the political orientations value or support, the targets, the demographic targets that the different orientations tax primarily, the different orientations towards the view of supply and demand, plus, lastly, the different orientations of involvement in the economy. So when we get to the involvement in the economy, I think you'll see how this information is the natural outcome of the concepts and approaches above it. So first of all, historical figures that you may be familiar with. On the far left, you can see we have Stalin, Hugo Chavez, Lenin, Mao Zedong. More moderate left in North America would be Bernie Sanders from the United States, Jagmeet Singh from here in Canada. The centralist orientation would be more characterized by Justin Trudeau, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton. Moderate right would be the Bushes, Junior and Senior, previous presidents of the United States. Donald Trump, Margaret Thatcher. Stephen Harper would also be characterized as a moderate right-wing oriented politician, and Mr. Modi from India. So even within this moderate right wing, there's a spectrum. So I think Donald Trump, for example, would be more further right than, say, Stephen Harper or Mr. Modi from India. And then on the far right, as you can see, we've got Hitler from Germany, Pinochet from Chile, Franco from Spain, and another historical example would be Benito Mussolini from Italy. So those are all historical figures, and you can see where they are placed on the political spectrum. So what are these orientations based on? First of all, as you can see, the extreme left. You're probably familiar with the Communist Manifesto written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. That is the foundational philosophy of the extreme left or the left wing. On the far right, in contrast, we have The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. We have The Origin of the Species by Charles Darwin. And more recently, we have Milton Friedman. All those works of literature support a more right-wing oriented political perspective. And in the middle, we have the centralist, which is not as likely a dogmatic in their support of the different orientations and much more flexible. Other names these orientations appear as, one would be on the left, communism or communist, that's a far left. More moderate left wing would be described as a socialist or a socialism, and in Canada that is known as the New Democratic Party. A more centralist orientation would be the Liberal Party here in Canada, or in the United States it would be the more Democratic Party. And on the moderate right we have capitalism, the general term used to describe this place on the political spectrum. We have the Conservative Party from Canada, and in the United States it's known as the Republican Party. The extreme right, in turn, Hitler followed the Hitler is described as a fascist, and his party was the Nazi Party. What do they each support? Very different. We'll start to see some big distinctions here. On the extreme left, the values they would support would be collectivism. They would support equality. They would support cooperation across society. They would support the equal distribution of wealth. They would support the idea of altruism. Moderate left would be more supportive of a more equal distribution of wealth. Centralist would be more supportive of a more balanced or moderate distribution of wealth, no extremes. The more right, now we're moving towards the idea that there should be some unequal distribution of wealth. That's a natural occurrence because, in keeping with Charles Darwin's survival of the fittest, inequality is a natural outcome of society. A society that is characterized by competition, that values independence, that values entrepreneurialism, is also characterized by a polarization of wealth. In an extreme right-wing oriented country, we will have extreme poverty and we will have extreme wealth. Another way these orientations can be differentiated is by their tax bases. On the extreme left, we have the belief that the economy is owned by the people. More moderate left, we support the idea that the wealthy members of society are taxed more heavily, and we support the idea that businesses are taxed more heavily. In contrast, on the far right, there's an orientation. The orientation supports the idea that the middle class should be taxed more heavily. And in the central, we have the idea that the taxation is pretty much as vulnerable to or subject to the cycles of the economy. So there's not a tendency to always focus on one segment or one type of participant in the economy as the primary foundation for the tax base. Supply and demand are also distinctly different across the orientations politically. For example, the extreme left supports building the economy through creating demand. One way you can create demand or allow people to have more money is through infrastructure projects. On the extreme right, in contrast, the economy is built by allowing the wealthy people to have more money, they are taxed less, and through that wealth, they will be more likely to create economic activity through the creation of new ventures or the expansion of existing businesses, thereby creating more jobs in the economy. So they're fundamentally different approaches to the way the economy should be turned on. The involvement in the economy. The extreme left supports, or is often criticized for, I should say, big government. Government is highly involved in the economy in a left-wing oriented political environment. The economy is characterized by lots of regulations, and those regulations are aimed to control businesses. Public ownership is much more common. Monopolies, publicly owned monopolies are more common, and you'll hear phrases such as nationalization, expropriation, and confiscation as being characteristics of a more left-wing oriented economy. There is minimal respect for private property and minimal respect for intellectual property. We also have on the extreme left a centralized, or often it's described as a command economy. Jumping over to the far right, in contrast to big government on the left, here we have small government. The right is described as supporting the idea of small government. And that is because the right believes, in keeping with the survival of the fittest, independence, the wealth of nations, and the origin of species, less government in the economy is better. Free enterprises are what is desired. The enterprises should be free to function in the economy Consequently, there are fewer regulations that are there to control business, and as a result, the extreme right or the right wing is described as supporting deregulation, removing the regulations from the economy. In keeping with that deregulation, a phrase you will hear is industry self-regulation being practiced. Additionally, the right wing is characterized by privatization. So public institutions, public assets are privatized, sold to the highest bidder, and commercialization of the economy is a characteristic. For example, we'll have private universities, private hospitals, because here we want enterprises, as I said earlier, to be free. Often you'll hear the phrase that the country with the right-wing orientation is open for business. Similarly, private property, in keeping with the idea of entrepreneurialism, and individual rights are very heavily protected. Land is highly valued by individuals and is owned by individuals. We have monopolies also on the far right and the right, but they are privately owned. Similarly, at the very bottom, we have what's described as a decentralized economy, which is also in contrast to a centralized economy. So that was a very quick 11-minute and 30-second introduction to the political spectrum from a linear perspective.